Okay, just going to take a quick second here. You're going to get to meet everyone that's listed here this evening, but this is our University of Minnesota beef team. With us this evening is Dana Adams, Extension Educator at Stearns, Benton, Morrison counties, Dr. Joe Armstrong, our Cattle Productions Educator, Stacy Cawhey, Dr. Alfredo Di Costanzo, Brenda Miller, Dr. Eric Mosel, Troy Salzer, Tara Young, and myself, Melissa Runk. I went through that kind of fast, but I'm gonna, everybody will kind of introduce themselves as they start speaking. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Joe to get us started tonight.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. Our goal tonight is to just get straight to the point, really get down to what we think you need to be thinking about. Real specifics we're probably going to cover in questions. If you have them, please put them in the chat. You can ask them at the end. We'll answer those things at the end. So first thing that we need to talk about, early weaning and culling cows. These are two strategies that we're going to have to probably lean heavily on as we get in farther into the drought. It's just a bad situation for everybody, but it's what we're dealing with now. Next slide, please, Dana. So with early weaning, the reason that we're early weaning is we're trying to reduce the pressure on the pasture. We're taking those calves off the pasture. They're not eating any more of the pasture. And we're also taking pressure off the cows to maintain their body condition when the quality and the amount of feed that's there might not be ideal. So when we early wean, we are getting a 15 to 20% reduction of the pressure on the pasture, and it's a way to save grass. So one of the things that we think about with all of this is, do we early wean everyone? In a lot of cases, the pasture's bad enough. The answer is yes. With that, we need to think about a couple of different things. When you start to not wean everyone at the same time, you start to, when you wean in steps, then you have to start worrying about marketing groups. And does that line up? Does it make sense? Are you going to end up with a bunch of small groups that aren't going to market well for you? Or are you really better off getting a uniform group by weaning everybody at once? A lot of this is just going to depend on pasture and hay. Like I said, if you're really, really short, it makes sense. You might just have to do everyone. But if you're somewhere in between, there is an option maybe to not have to wean everybody. So who do we look at early weaning if we're not going to wean everybody? Well, that comes into low body condition. So anybody who's really struggling to maintain that body condition, those calves should come off. And then anybody who's still growing. So they're trying to grow themselves and grow a calf. Those are the heifers that need it the most. So those might be your options if you're not going to wean everybody. When we're talking vaccines, it really is I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. So if the majority of your calves are under 4 months old, then you should vaccinate after weaning. Just wait, do the same schedule, but just wait until 2 to 3 weeks after weaning. That stress is over, and then go ahead and run your vaccine schedule at the ages that you normally would. If they're over 4 months old, they're old enough, they have a mature immune system, you can go ahead and use your regular schedule, your pre-weaning and weaning, or however you work that. So how early is too early? I get this question a lot lately. And for me, you have to have a working rumen to wean. You can't let that calf try to grow and maintain and get nutrients if the rumen isn't working yet. So usually that takes about 3 months, 12 weeks. But a lot of that is dependent on creep feeding, if you've been creep feeding or not. So you might be able to, if you've been creep feeding since day one, since they were born, you might be able to bring it all the way down to 9 weeks, but that's really pushing it, because you really need that rumen to be working. With all of this, I mean, you have to focus extra on the low stress side of things. Castration, you need to separate that from weaning, ideally either way before or wait and do it after. Water, feed, flies, shade, dust, all those things need to be taken care of. And we can answer questions on those later if we need to get into the details. Next slide, please, Dana. So one of the other things that we're working on in addition to early weaning is culling cows. I know probably a lot of you might have started this process already. I've been hearing about a lot of cattle moving, a lot of cows leaving. And this is kind of the hierarchy of how I think cows should go if you're trying to make those decisions. And for me, it's open. Anybody open that you know is open, they should be gone. They're not making you money. Anybody who's really, really late bred then becomes the next one on the list. because they don't fit your calving window. You know, they're probably going to be bred late the next year, and they're the least profitable cow in your herd currently. After that, you can start sorting on body condition if we're talking about cows, and just who's struggling to keep up already, because you know they're going to struggle when we don't have that kind of feed. And after that, you can get into the details of your records if you have them, to look at who's been late bred in the past, who's likely to be late bred this year, who's getting up there in age, who doesn't have teeth if you want to run them to the chute that way. And then, you know, that's how we look at it. Now, a lot of people are going straight to number 8 here and getting rid of non-necessary replacements. And I'm seeing a lot of heifers moving, and that's fine. And because they're ready to go in the feedlot a lot of the time. And if you really don't need them, that might be a good option too, because of the other things that are happening, and potentially the market being really, really good this year and next year. So how many should go? That's the other question I get a lot. And I think 25 to 30% of the herd is a good target if you're really short on grass. Now, it's a balancing act, right? Like I said, the market could be good this year in the fall, could be good next year. So you don't want to get rid of all your calves. You want to get rid of just enough cows that you can still be profitable next year, or potentially just break even this year is what we're looking at for a lot of people. And maybe even the other conversation of just losing the least amount of money. Now, who should stay? I'm a big proponent of keeping those 3 to 6 year old cows and really keeping that core intact, because those are your most profitable cows, your proven cows, those who you need to keep. Now, the other piece of this is you need to think about taxes. You need to talk to your banker and figure that out. There are all sorts of different options. There's some programs in some places available that you could get rid of that cows. And if it is declared an emergency, maybe that money wouldn't be taxable as long as you use it to replace those animals later. There's all sorts of options. You need to talk to your banker about that. And with that, I'm done with that section, and we'll move on to Melissa and water.
Okay. All right, so Dana's going to pull up the next slide, and I'm going to talk a little bit about water concerns. This is a question that I have been getting a lot down here, even in Southwest, and even with the rain that we've been getting the last, I mean, I hate to even say that, but with some of the rain we've been getting the last few weeks, people are asking, well, do I still, you know, it looks like my dugout's refilling, the creek's running again. My stock pond doesn't seem as bad as it was, you know, early this summer. I probably shouldn't, I should be safe, right? And the answer is that if you are having any questions or any doubt, even if your water sources are being replenished, it's still a really good idea to get it tested. The main things that we're concerned in terms of water, first of all, quantity. Do we have enough out there? Quality issues, and then when do we need to be bringing in some additional sources? So in terms of quantity, you know, obviously, do we have enough out there? Is our current water source supplying enough for everybody that's out on that pasture, out in that pen, to get enough per day? Remember, cows are going to drink about 20 gallons per day. Calves can drink anywhere from 5 to 8 gallons per day. Access to the water source. Can cattle safely get to the water source? Or do we, and is it really silty? Is it really muddy around the perimeter? Like we talked earlier this spring, if you tuned into those webinars, you know, once calves go in there, they'll go in there once to try to get water. If it's really muddy in there, they'll get stuck, they'll panic. Hopefully they'll get out all right, but they're not going to return to that water source because they're not going to put themselves through that. That was really stressful for them. And we got to remember that mama's milk, especially for older calves, that's just not enough to supply their water source on a daily basis. Quality issues. If you want to hit the button, Dana, and bring that little chart, the next chart up. We got quite a few things that we are concerned with in terms of what we are measuring in terms of overall quality for our water. So the first thing is our TDS, or our salinity. TDS refers to our total dissolved solids. So that's basically that it refers to the salt dissolved in water, and it's expressed in parts per million or milligrams per liter. And so this basically denotes your water salinity. So what happens is that, you know, our higher salt levels, that can cause cattle to drink more, but when we get to a really high salt level, it can actually turn cattle away from the water. They don't want to drink. And really, you know, cattle just have differing tolerance levels as far as what they're willing to go back and drink. Next issue, you know, or next thing we would measure for is pH. You know, that denotes our alkalinity or our acidity level of our water. We need to be concerned about the nitrate level in our water source. Water sources can be a toxic source of nitrates for livestock, and I'm not going to go too much into it because I know that our next presenters are going to touch on this even more, but we need to be concerned about nitrate levels in our feed sources as well as our water, and of course, consider both of these sources. And what's your nitrate level going to be, and do you need to be concerned about that? Another thing that we would measure in the water quality is, or that we're concerned about, is our sulfates. Ruminants are especially susceptible to high levels of sulfates, and sulfur, you can tie up your copper and reduce the availability in the diet to that animal. And so we also need to be concerned about a high sulfate level and that interaction, how that interacts with molybdenum. And then another issue, and it's really small here, but cyanobacteria, or what we would most often hear as being termed blue-green algae. So that's when, in drought situations, when we, haven't had steady rainfall, this is where we see that that greenish, turquoise, tealish color appearing in the water. And just know that you can have blooms of cyanobacteria and still not see that color in the water. If this is something that you have a concern with, it's just a really, really good idea to get your water tested. So it responds, this type of bacteria responds to sunlight, and it appears in stagnant water, in drought, in times of drought. And then, it's just the perfect bacteria for this to grow rampant. And then some other issues that we are concerned with is, could be concerned with like coliform, maybe you have some issues with well water, cracks in your well, things like that. That can all be measured with, pretty inclusive water quality test. So just, in summary, get your water tested. If you're questioning it at all, I had a producer tell me yesterday that he's like, I took your recommendation, Melissa, I got my water tested, and it was a pretty cheap peace of mind to know that my water sources checked out all right. So some other things, if we are concerned about our water sources, we know we don't have enough adequate amounts out there. Maybe we got our water test back and we need to be concerned about it. And all of a sudden we can't use our current, creek, dugout, etc. out on pasture. What are other sources? Is there someplace, if it's just a quantity issue, is there someplace else you can move them to on the pasture that maybe has some more available water? It isn't quite so dry. Or do you need to consider hauling in water? Just some recommendations, and Dr. Joe and Dr. Eric had put this out earlier in a resource. Make sure that you're hauling your water well in advance. Cattle got to establish that pecking order, and we also want to make sure that cattle, before they actually run out of water, that they're used to drinking out of that tank, they're comfortable drinking out of that additional water source. Also, make sure that if you're taking them off, away from a dugout, pond, etc., they're going to want to go back in there, especially when it gets hot. Make sure that you put up a perimeter fence, or at least to keep them away from that, so that you don't have cows going in there into the mud. You don't have calves following them. And also just make sure that if you are bringing in a tank or something to bring in extra water, that calves can reach that water source once it gets drank down by cows. So with that, that's all that I have for water concerns. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dana now.
All right, thank you, Melissa.
Oh, sorry, I forgot that picture.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry. It's Troy and
that.
Tara. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. You can go to the next slide, Dana. We've been experiencing a ton of drought related inconsistencies, I would say, in all of our yield in the pastures and the hayfield. I'm sure many of people have been feeling the stress, even if you've fertilized and have your soil fertility at top notch. We've still experienced a lot of drought. Unfortunately, just a lot of drought inconsistencies. So what Troy and I have kind of worked on is alternative forages for a lot of people. We've been getting calls from, have been wondering, okay, what can we do now in the short term, but also the long term? So long-term planning. And that's kind of what we're really going to discuss tonight. So here's a very, very busy table we will be sending this out in an email afterwards and a link. So you'll definitely be able to review it later. But what we did was, because there's a lot of information here that you can go back and look at later, depending on what your strategy with you choose. But what we wanted to touch on here and just give you a lot of information about the types of plants, the seeding rate, the seeding depth, and the geographic differences, especially because Troy and I work in northern Minnesota, so it's very different compared to southern and central Minnesota. So we wanted to put those dates out there, as well as the use. I think this is a very important key to have, to know if it fits into your system, if it fits into your scenario that you're working on right now, especially depending on the resources that you have. If you have a wrapper, then that's great, then you can do baleage, but let's maybe look at other strategies if you don't. So that's why we wanted to put this really kind of overwhelming graph on here. But we also wanted to point out that there's a lot of different plant species that are grouped together. So you see the different colors, the warm season annuals, the spring cereals, winter cereals, and the grazing mix-ins. So now all of those have very different characteristics, and basically what each one is going to serve a different purpose. And that's what Troy is going to talk about, the different strategies associated with those different characteristics. But before I turn it over to him, I just wanted to point out that none of this will be possible if your soil fertility is not up to snuff, basically, because annual forages need a lot of nutrients going into, because they have such a short amount of time that they have to actually grow and provide biomass, that definitely making sure that you put it in a location that you know that you have very good soil fertility, because we're kind of on a tight window here. And but definitely wanted to show you the different strategies, and that's what Troy will be talking about. So I'll pass it to Troy.
Dana, if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you, Tara. That was a great setup in relationship to looking at some of these annual forages. In many cases, people don't think about utilizing these until they run into problems like we're having this year. But I think that there's a tremendous amount of value to think about these on a regular basis as a way in which to capture some value from areas like sacrifice areas, but also areas where we might be thinking about renovating a field. As we look at that first bar for summer annuals, we can utilize things like sorghum sudan grass, millets, things that really corn for grazing specifically, even planting late corn can give you a lot of yield in a very short period of time. And that's where that high nutrient concentration in the soil really benefits you from allowing that to get planted. The soil conditions are right, and they really begin to grow very, very quickly. The nice thing about summer annuals is they can germinate and grow pretty well in very dry conditions. And so I've seen some really nice sorghum sudan grass in northeastern Minnesota growing after virtually no rain on that seed whatsoever. Another option in the second bar there is the spring and fall cereals. Oftentimes, I think especially fall seeded cereals are often overlooked based upon the fact that they're not very commonly used, but there's been a tremendous amount of data that would suggest yields from that in the tune of about 1 to 1.5 tons of dry matter per acre of very, very high quality feed that can be utilized with lower quality feed if you're working in a situation where you do have some low quality feed that you need to supplement. It works great that way. And then often also overlooked is the use of winter cereals such as winter rye, winter triticale, as well as winter wheat. Not only can we potentially graze them a little bit in fall if there's adequate growth, but more importantly, if fertilized right and well established, we can also look at starting our grazing season next spring much, much earlier in the tune of 2 to 3 weeks. And with that in mind, that can be very high quality feed that can get them off of that stored feed, especially when the stored feed quantity that's available out there is in such short supply. Next slide, please. Next, we can turn it over to Dana.
Thank you, Troy. So both myself and Dr. Mosel are going to talk about forage toxicity and the concerns that lie there, just for everyone to keep in mind, because it is a very real concern right now. So the way that we decided to frame this was by starting the discussion around 2 assumptions, is that the growing conditions that lead to nitrate toxicity, the one that we're going to focus on right now is drought, which we're all very aware of. And so you know what causes nitrate toxicity to become an issue, to start moving around in our spheres. And you also understand what to look for behavior-wise in your cattle when the threat of nitrate toxicity looms. So we're looking for things like they're staggering, they're breathing hard because they're struggling getting that oxygen to their tissues. And you might see a change in mucosal membrane. So by that, I mean, we go from bright, perky, bright pink eyes and mouth to like more of a dusky, darker colored mucosal membrane. So those are the behaviors and the physical signs that you look out for to say, that might be nitrate toxicity, I should do something. Another assumption that we're going to make is that because you realize that nitrate toxicity may be an issue you're combating, you may send your forage to a lab. So I linked a couple of labs below. There's Cumberland Valley, Dairyland, and DHIA. I had the privilege of just getting to know DHIA today. So I swung by the lab this morning, and when I asked him, like, are you getting more forage samples requesting nitrates, he said, the lab manager said, on Monday we got 15. So it's, people are aware and they're taking steps. It is a highly encouraged way of knowing what your animals are exposed to and being able to plan for steps to being proactive rather than reactive. So now that we have those assumptions, we know that we're dealing with nitrates, we know what to look for in our cattle, we know where to send our labs, what do we do? So if we're sending our forage sample to a lab, how do we do that? Just to start the discussion. So if you put in a poor quality sample, you're not going to get the best data back. So how do you put in that good quality sample so that the forage lab can answer the question you're asking? So the way that you would do that from like an ag bag would be to, I like to look at it as if a ag bag is a circle, you reach into you divide it into quarters and you take a sample from each one of the quarters and you take it into your shop and you dump it out into onto a clean countertop, mix it all together. And according to DHIA, you're going to take a sandwich size sample and put that into a sandwich bag and then send that to the lab. They appreciate the giant ice cream pails that I saw, but they only need a sandwich bag. They also told me to tell all you guys that if you can chop up the sample, that helps significantly. And there is and with DHIA, there is a $5 fee for chopping your sample. So take the 2-3 minutes to chop up your sample, put it in that bag for testing. So we talked about getting that quality sample into the lab. When you sample from a field, you want to collect for that sample what the animals eat. So if it's, if they're doing rotational grazing strategy, then you would take the part of the plant that the animal would eat. That also should be indicative of weather. So if it's kind of overgrazed, then you have to take that sample too, but make sure that what you're sending is reflective of what the animal eats. I know that the quick test for nitrates is out there. So it is a tool in your tool chest, but what it does is like, it's pretty broad spectrum. It tells you if you're in trouble. If you hand that information to your nutritionist, there's not much they can do. They get more value and they can help you more if you have a sample from a forage lab rather than that quick test. That accuracy and precision is there from the forage lab while it's not with the quick test. So it's a tool, But if you need precision, the forage lab is your friend. When you collect those samples, I would highly discourage leaving them on the dash for a couple of days or forgetting about them in the seat. What they should do is they should be popped into a cooler and sent out so that they can get to the forage lab in appropriate time. I also highly encourage anytime you take samples for lab testing that you pick a lab that you like and you stick with it, just so that you have some context as to what things need. If you bounce around to labs, then you're switching languages, you're switching like the way that they do their tests. And we can do a little bit better by staying with a lab just to maintain that accuracy, that common language that we know and understand. So we have a high nitrate forage. What do we do? Well, what you can do is not do it all by yourself. So I highly encourage to talk to your veterinarian or your nutritionist to kind of clue them in as to your concerns, what steps you want to take, and work with your farm team rather than doing this all alone. Also, I prefer to use multiple feeding strategies in order to limit the amount of nitrates that they get at a given time. So those strategies can include slowly increasing the amount of nitrates that they are exposed to over about a 2 to 3 week period. So they're not just going from 0 to 60 in a day. That is asking a lot of their body to adjust to. So it should be the maximum inclusion that you want. You should step into that level that you're including in their diet. They are able to adapt to nitrates to an extent, but it is better to be modest than to ask too much. So slowly increase the amount of nitrates that they're exposed to in the diet. Another tactic to use would be to do more mini meals. So what we're combating is them getting a lot of nitrates at one time. So if we have a smaller amount of nitrates and smaller meals, they're more able to process that than a whole, like eating as much as they can of a high nitrate diet. We don't want that at all. We want small amounts of nitrates so that their body can adjust and process those nitrates that they're struggling with. Another thing you can do, I think about it as like you have a mini container of popcorn before your actual meal, just so that they get that low nitrate meal to kind of fill them up. And then we allow them to have nitrates so they're not as greedy and they don't eat a whole bunch of nitrates. So we want to fill them up, give bulk before they get those nitrates in their diet, just as a way of slowing down the amount of nitrates that they're consuming. And of course, for the following 2 to 3 hours that they eat those high nitrate forages, you should be watching them. As in like, are your mucosal membranes changing? Are you breathing harder? Are you staggering around because you're having trouble breathing? Just giving you a chance to adjust and fine tune that ration, maybe like reach out to your veterinarian if you need some assistance. As far as like if you're working with a high nitrate hay, you can move it into a bag that allows it to ensile and can drop the nitrate levels about 10 to 30%, but giving dropping those nitrate levels so that you can include it in the diet. So it's not a wash, you just have to give it time in order to break down. Also, I want to make very clear that you test it like at its beginning point, test it on the other side. Don't just believe that the nitrates have dropped, but know that they have decreased to an amount where you can include it at modest amounts in the diet. If you're working with bales, you can wrap them to make baleage, again, ensiling, dropping those nitrates. And if you're feeding a dry feed, it's not a wash. Work with a fellow producer to sell or trade. So with someone who can mix it into their ration. It doesn't have to be included. You can work with your fellows to find a way in order to make it through this situation. What we want to avoid is just dropping it into a round bale, into a ring and just letting them have at it. That's a lot of nitrates at one time, and we want to avoid that situation. What you would see is that you might see abortions, you might see breeding back issues just because they're struggling with those nitrates. And in a worst case scenario, it could result in death, which we don't want. So we want to control the amount of nitrates that they get at a given time and just not hope that it's going to work out, but instead control the situation so that they're able to cope. Dr. Mosel.
Okay, thanks, Dana. I'm just going to talk very briefly about some issues with summer annuals, primarily thinking about prussic acid production, which we can see in the sorghums, Sudan grasses, and sorghum Sudan crosses. Prussic acid is hydrogen cyanide, which the plant produces most readily when it is just starting to grow and it's less than 2 feet tall. And then the prussic acid, as it gets over 2 feet tall, the prussic acid tends to dilute significantly and is really no longer an issue to be concerned about. But then again, in fall, if one of these species, when they get frosted, we will see a big spike in prussic acid for approximately a week after the frost. And then it tends to dilute out again and can be used as a forage source. So it's difficult to say in practice how big of an issue prussic acid really is. You don't see prussic acid poisoning that often, but it does happen. So it's just something to be aware of. And certainly if you get a frost before you're ready to hay or chop those particular species, then we need to be very careful in the days immediately following that frost. If you don't have a lot of experience with sorghums or Sudan grasses or those types of forages, I might suggest it would be a better idea to maybe think about either a German or a pearl millet, which do not produce prussic acid. And as Troy pointed out earlier, short season corn is also a really good option. Of course, keeping in mind that millet and corn do tend to be pretty prolific nitrate accumulators. And so we will want to be careful from that aspect. Thank you, Dana.
Alfredo, you there?
Good.
Alfredo? You're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, got you now.
Well, this is kind of slow. I'm sorry, I apologize. Anyway, thank you, Dana, for putting on the slides there. And thank you to all of you that are participating tonight. Excellent presentations, lots of good information. Please keep sending questions. And I hope you can see some recovery, at least in the central part of the state. More recently, there has been some rain. I keep looking at the radar to our friends in North Dakota. I hope that straightens out soon. I see nice cumulus clouds. I'm in southwest, well, actually I'm southeast South Dakota at the moment, hoping that some of the rain that we have seen spreads to other parts of the country that need it. So hopefully that straightens out soon and we can retake maybe some of the moisture going into the winter more so at this point. So to get started, I want to show you this little cycle of production, and that would be the case for any summer situation. When you can see the top of the slide and that green top right of the slide, looking at a situation of grass, assuming that you had it or you still have some of it. If you do, about an inch of grass will represent about 300 pounds of dry matter to the acre. So if you happen to still have about 8 inches of grass regrowth from the early part of summer, and that would be the case for us in the southeast corner of the state, that would translate to roughly about 2,400 pounds of dry matter per acre. So about each inch of grass growth you see out there represents 300 pounds. This is not a standard figure for everything, but for most areas that would take care of things. So any height, any pasture with sward heights of 6 inches or greater would be suitable for grazing. If for some reason you happen to find this situation to be lower than 6 inches, then you're moving down to the southwest corner of this picture now, where you can see us moving to the consideration of going to a dry lot feeding situation. So two things that happen. One, do we have grass? Number two, do we have a good condition score on the cows, which would be a condition score 5 or greater. If that's the case, then we graze down to about 50%. This is no different than what we do heading into the winter. And when it gets to that 50%, if it started at 8 inches and hopefully we're down to 4 inches and we have to quit grazing so we don't destroy that pasture for next year. The alternative situation would be that condition score is less than 5, even though we might have grass. Well, that might help you for a little bit, but then cows may need supplementary nutrition. And Stacy will talk a little bit more about supplementary nutrition. We'll do that here in the next slide, but the question is, do we need to be considering that now? And for many of us in the northwest corner of the state, as we heard earlier at the Minnesota State Cattlemen's Executive Board meeting, that there would be some situations that are demanding that we consider dry lot feeding. So next slide will tell us what options we have, Dana, for presenting to cows in a dry lot situation. I have to say a disclaimer on this slide. This is feeding cattle for simply caloric maintenance. Cattle fed, the amounts on this slide will not gain weight. This is a situation where you might be so limited in forage on the sward height or in the hay shed to the point that you're gonna totally limit feed cattle and hope that things turn around. And now we're really waiting for next year, not so much the fall perhaps. So in looking at this, what I have on the left side in the first column, it would be cattle weight from 500 to 1,500 pounds. If we were turning them out to graze at 50% utilization, if we had a herd of 100 animals, so use that for a reference, we would need about a half an acre for calves weighing 500 pounds. Now, that would mean tomorrow we would need another half acre. The next day we would need another half acre, et cetera, et cetera. For grazing the mature cow herd at 1,500 pound cows, it would take us 1.1 acres a day to keep 100 cows on there, and we would have to move them on. And that's, again, just for maintenance. If we translate that to hay feeding in pounds to give you a reference of how much or how little you need of hay, and translating that to dollars using hay at $150 a ton, let's get back to that 1,500 pound cow. We would need to feed them 21 pounds. They would not gain anything. And if they're milking, they're gonna quit milking. I'm just giving you this as a reference. That will cost you $1.61 with $150 a ton hay if you can find it. If you can find corn silage, which if you don't have it, you won't have it, that's about 38 pounds of that product, and it'll cost you $1.34. If, on the other hand, you need to go to corn grain, that's about a 12-pound ration a day, costing you $1.53 per head. My point of this slide is it time for you to consider feeding grain and a little bit of hay? Data from Ohio State University has demonstrated that we can feed up to 15 pounds of corn. Sounds like a lot of money, but if you need to save your cow herd, and I'll give you a reason for that in a second, if you need to save your cow herd for the future, you may need to resort to feeding expensive corn with a little bit of hay. So if you have any forage left, if you can turn around and buy some straw, and I've been looking at some of the auction offers around here, and hopefully some of the ones are not drying up. we are going to be able to find some straw and stock bales still out there, probably for $100, $120. But that would take about 12 to 15 pounds of corn grain and 3 to 5 pounds of hay or straw or something like that to be able to do that. So think about this slide a little bit of things that you can do. On the far left is how many acres you need. On the far right is how many pounds of corn you might need. Many of us, or in the northwest corner of the state for North Dakota, might be to the point where if they wish to save their cow herd, they're going to have to do grain feeding. We'll talk about some other alternatives, but one reason to hang on to your cows, if I can give you any positive news, is that we're supposed to be seeing better cattle prices in the next 2 to 3 years. How good? About as good or better than you saw in 2015. So this is not quite the time to get rid of the cows. Next slide, please. So the last thing to consider is it time to bring those cows into dry lot? One of the biggest things to maybe look at is, can we consider renting space in a feedlot? If somebody has some pen capacities, and that is also getting at a premium because fat cattle prices are turning around. We read today that there is a miscalculation, you might say, not quite that. The projections have been lowered for beef production in the US by about 500 million pounds of beef, which is really good news, meaning to say that fat cattle prices will probably remain high for the remaining of the year. So it may be hard to get into a feedlot. Why a feedlot? Because somebody else will worry about facilities, water, mixer, oversight of the cattle that you might have to put out there. And then have you consider a minimum cost of about $2 for feed and somewhere from 50 cents to about $1 yardage. So it will be expensive to keep these cows, but it might be worth it unless you can turn around, sell your herd and turn around and buy it back sometime next year. Otherwise, for yourself to do dry lotting, especially before the winter turns on, this is the things you have to worry about. Space and labor from about 150 to 1,000 square feet per cow. You need to consider at least an hour to 2 hours of your time taking care of feeding daily. Feed storage, if you're gonna buy grain, you have to prevent it going to waste because so many times water enters the storage area, or wind when we're loading things on a supplement, it might blow things away. So you have to be careful with that. On feed delivery, back to the grain feeding, you have to make sure that you're gonna have enough space for these cows, somewhere in the range of 12 at least inches to perhaps better than that, 36 inches axis, which means if the ground is that dry, maybe use it as your nice summer grain feeding area and spread that corn out a lot wider than you would suspect so that those cows can spread themselves and catch the feed they need. Ultimately, and it was mentioned earlier by Melissa, water supply is extremely important. She mentioned access and flow. About 40 cows drink with calves drinking from a flow rate of about 10 gallons per minute would actually require 140 minutes to drink. If you keep pushing that number, you got to realize that the entire herd needs to drink in 3 hours to maybe 5 hours tops. So water flow becomes a real important concern. The reason I bring this up is it sounds easy to go into a dry lot. It's not that easy. So you may consider putting cattle in your cows in a feedlot and maybe paying somebody else to do that. And I believe that concludes my presentation. Thank you much, and we will visit with you later.
All right, so now we're gonna go into trying to improve some of your poorer quality forages and supplements. Kind of what can you do on the pastures right now to help and try to get you through this dry period. So some different options that we can do to add some protein and energy to those poor quality pastures that are getting down there. We can add in some lick tanks. So you can get a liquid and put it in a lick tank where I like to use kind of a 40% protein molasses-based liquid. And they'll typically eat anywhere from maybe a half a pound to 2 pounds, depending on the type of liquid you have. It can kind of help get you through. You can also use that same liquid and pour bales. So you're going to be looking at using that 40% liquid, and you're going to pour the bales. If you stand them upright, you're going to put on about maybe 100 pounds per bale. So that's another option to maybe try and use some corn stalks, some ditch hay, anything that you can to kind of get through this, a way for them to eat it. You can also purchase some cooked lick tubs. A lot of times you'll see these as a 30% protein lick tub. These are a little bit more expensive, but they will help with some forage utilization with that molasses in there. So a lot of that molasses will provide readily available energy. So it'll help with digesting some of that poor quality forage and keep those rumens functioning properly. Some other things that you can do is look at getting some distillers in. So either getting some wet cake or getting some dry distillers and adding that to a TMR mix. So we can, if you are lucky enough to have a TMR, you can use some of those corn stalks, some straw, your ditch hay, and put either that liquid or distillers onto that to try and help stretch it through. We also want to make sure, I know it's been brought up a bunch, but make sure you're testing your forages so you can help place them into your program. You want to make sure that you've got a plan moving forward. You want to make sure that you don't use all your best forages right now to try to get them through this period. And by the time you get into your third trimester, you're down to just poor quality. So make sure you test all of your hay sources, so we can make sure that you can have your nutritionist or anybody help you put those in the correct spots and help you stretch that throughout your program. And as always, make sure you're keeping mineral in front of your cows. It's important now. There's not a lot of minerals left in those pastures right now, so they're going to be needing to pick them up through your loose mineral. And we did kind of talk about creep feeding calves. This will help those pastures out right now. It's been, a lot of research has been done that creep feeding during a drought is extremely beneficial. So might be something to consider if you aren't doing that right now. Some other ways to use your pastures is make sure that to help extend it, make sure you're spreading everything out. So put your mineral, not everything in the same spot. So spread your water source to your mineral, so they're using that whole pasture and you're not having anything, no spots laid by. So, and then, anything you can do to help stretch that out. So use those lick tanks, talk to your nutritionist and see if there's anything that you can use to help extend. If they've got any products that you can extend your forages. Dana, that next slide, I think you might be at, yep.
Okay, guys, we got some questions that came in here on the chat. The first one is for Joe. It says, my youngest calf was born on April 22nd. The next is, the next one is 327. Have not been creeping, but usually wean mid-August for 2 months, then ship to feedlot. Is August 1st, would that not be too early?
So I think you're going to be okay, because usually when we're talking about the youngest calf, even at August 1, we're almost 4 months old. And I think that is just fine. That means the majority of your calves are older than 4 months, which means that they should be just fine to wean, even if you haven't been creeping. You're going to want to watch them pretty close, and there's going to be some tricky things with the ration if you do move them into a dry lot, because it might be a little more concentrated than you would normally think. But you should be just fine. And because the majority of your calves are over 4 months old, you should be able to run your normal vaccination schedule. So everything will just shift up by that 2 to 3 weeks ahead of when you would normally do it. And everything should work about the same. And I wouldn't worry about those calves too much at all.
Great, thank you, Joe. The next one is for Dana. During your visit to the DHIA lab, did they share what locations samples were being received from and what nitrate concentrations they were measuring?
They actually didn't. I asked a little bit, but I had just been, I had sent stuff there in the past, and I was really interested in their milk processing. So how they were testing milk and where that data went. So I got a little bit distracted, but I did get, I was very interested, and I spoke to the forage specialist and kind of like directed her towards Joe and using us more as a resource in order to kind of like help communicate with producers. So didn't catch those numbers and answer the question.
Okay, thanks, Dana. This question has kind of been asked and answered, but I'm just going to ask it for those who may be listening in. Dairyland tests my hay. What is the abbreviation for the nitrates, and what is considered high? And Joe answered in the chat box, sometimes it is listed as NO3. And Stacy, can you explain a little bit on those numbers that you provided?
Yeah, so this is at Dairyland, so just make sure you know that. But for Dairyland, your nitrate samples, if it's under 1,000, it's considered pretty safe, and they're basing that on a 1,000-pound cow. And then if it gets up to 1,000 to 2,000, it's safe, but just be careful or be aware. 2,000 to 4,000, you want to make sure that you limit the amount fed, so no more than half the ration has that feed in it. And then if it's over 4,000, it's potentially toxic, so do not feed. That's how they interpret them.
Okay, and this next question goes along with the nitrates as well. What will it do to just weaned calves? So I suppose if your nitrates are kind of high, like what effect does it have on those weaned calves?
Well, I mean, it's very similar, at least the initial signs. I mean, the biggest thing you're going to see right away is a mucous membrane color change. And so it should be nice and bright and pink, and it will turn to gray, kind of a muddy color, and eventually blue. Now that's your first change, and that's the most important one to keep an eye on, because that starts to happen when met hemoglobin is at 20% or so of your entire hemoglobin storage. That's the first sign, because some of these other signs, when we're talking about panting, and it's really hard to see, like visually see an accelerated heart rate, but panting, heavy breathing, stumbling, those things don't show up until you're in quite a bit of trouble, and it's probably too late. So you really need to be checking, if you're worried about it, getting some cattle into the chute and checking mucous membrane color to see. And that would be underneath the gums, checking the gums and looking at that. On heifers, you can check inside the vulva if that's easier to access and is safer for you. But that's what you need to be checking, and you'll see the same thing. Now, be like Stacy was saying, that a lot of those numbers and the safety limits are set for 1,000-pound cow. So if you've got a 200, 300, 400-pound calf in there, you got to be careful, because if they fill up on high nitrate hay or whatever you're feeding, it doesn't take that much. So I and maybe someone else can comment on this too, who might know a little bit more. I start to get worried when I'm feeding calves at a much lower inclusion, or whatever you want to call it. A 500 parts per million is really, where we still see some lack of gains and some issues sometimes with fertility down that low. So that's where I get concerned. And that's, again, the importance of having your nutritionist involved in this conversation, and to not forget that all of this is additive with whatever's in your water. So you need to make sure that those don't combine and create a bigger problem.
Thank you, Joe. This one is kind of answered too, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So my hay test is just the basic hay test, but I see no nitrate numbers. And Stacy commented it might not be on just a basic sample. You might have to do an NIR sample. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, Stacy?
Yeah, so at Dairyland, that's who I use the most. That's who I'm most familiar with. But Dairyland, you're going to have about 3 different samples that you can do. So just your basic test isn't going to get you a whole lot, and your nutritionist isn't going to like that sample very well. There's not a lot of information other than it'll get you your dry matter and your protein and maybe a TDN kind of on there. So there's not a whole lot there. So you're going to want to go more into your NIRs and your wet chemistries to get those further numbers. And I don't know, Joe, if you want to comment on that too, but you're going to have to get a better package. So those are going to cost a little bit more money, but you're going to get a lot more information.
Yeah, I mean, that's really there's not a whole lot to add. I mean, you need to, when you walk in, you need to make it very clear that you need nitrates, and that's going to be, like I said, a little more expensive, but definitely worth the peace of mind.
Okay, that's all the questions that I saw come in. I think they've all been answered. So if anybody has some last minute questions, feel free to unmute yourself or drop them in the chat box. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
Just a comment in the chat from Alfredo, in case someone's listening. Nitrate analysis at Dairyland is $11 per sample, and it's under feed and forage. He prefers that you get it as a wet chemistry and not an NIR.
Sorry. We have one last question from Troy. Does protein in the grain impact the nitrate concentration if you are feeding higher nitrate forages as part of the whole ration?
I don't think I can answer that and know and be confident in my answer, Troy.
I was specifically looking to have Alfredo or perhaps Stacy or Eric as options as well.
Troy.
Yes, Alfredo.
And others. Yes, they would, but typically on some of these, well, you're talking about grain in this case, or are you talking forage?
I'm talking grain as protein content. So as the protein level in the grain ration goes up, will that inadvertently have an impact on the overall ability to feed higher or lower nitrate forages? And I believe I know, but I just would like your opinion on it.
Got it. Understand the question now. It should not.
Right.
If anything, it should maybe help because you have energy and you have protein. I hope it would be probably even some degradable protein to help digestion and to help move some of that material out and consume those nitrates. You see what I'm saying? So by activating the energy metabolism in that rumen, they should be able to take a little bit more nitrates. Obviously, the protein and the nitrate in the grain, the protein in the grain and the grain itself should be diluting the nitrates themselves. So it should be a positive thing overall.
Thank you, Alfredo. Another thing that we haven't done a very good job covering tonight, and I think it's really important, although it's not directly related to the aspects of beef cattle in necessarily, it's more the physiological aspects of how or why forages are high in nitrates. And that is a function of typically the plants being dormant for a fair amount of time, followed by a rain event that allows that plant to take off growing. And during that dormant period, it actually accumulates those nitrates in the root system, and then it is moved up in the plant as the plant begins to regrow. And that is the time that we have to be most cautious about the aspects of the nitrate poisoning. Over time, generally, the nitrate concentration does go down as that plant continues to elongate and in essence dilute that nitrate in that plant. And so that's a really important component. Small grains are especially, cereal grains are especially high nitrate accumulators. And as you in spring planted, or as you plant these crops, as you increase the nitrogen application, which is essential for growth, but as you increase it, it does increase the potential risk on those crops as well.
And that's an excellent point, Trey, because I think what we're seeing a lot is that some of these small grain crops that were planted are not turning around and not doing well. And there is that temptation to turn cattle out and use it, and people should, but you need to test that stuff before you do, especially if you do chop or do anything like that, and then are thinking about turning cattle out after that. Testing is going to be a huge component of that, because if we haven't done a good enough job yet of scaring everyone tonight on nitrates, I mean, you should be scared. This is a serious thing, and it can take cattle out very fast, and it's not a good thing to see.
Troy, I would also suggest that we appear to have reached the point where we also need to be concerned about pastures. Following our discussion this afternoon, I had 2 additional calls of the same scenario. And so we're seeing some pasture grass show up with nitrates in sufficient concentration to cause some problems. So particularly, I would say grass that hasn't been grazed, or at least not grazed heavily to this point, and you're turning cattle into those pastures, it might be a good idea to have a nitrate test done, just to make sure. It's not real clear if it's just specific grasses or what exactly the scenario is, but just I've heard a couple of instances where that's been an issue. And just adding on to what's already been discussed, have seen a tremendous number of cereal grain hay samples, which initially I didn't think would be that big of an issue. I thought the regrowth would be the bigger nitrate issue, but those first crop hay alpha cereal grains are coming in with extremely high nitrates.
Dr. Mosel, as a follow-up to that, was that how were you seeing the toxicity in the calves as well, or was it more in the cows, or even in heifers or yearlings, I guess?
At this point, it seems to be the biggest issue for calves. Generally, the larger end of the calves that are consuming some of the grass, in addition to presumably a portion of their nitrate load coming through the milk from the cow, would be my guess.
Thank you.
I think we kind of answered this one up a little bit, but I think this was probably be for Eric. How likely is it to get high nitrates from pasture grazing?
Yeah, as we were just discussing, normally this is not a big issue, but for whatever reason, it seems that we've hit a point where, particularly in pastures that have not been grazed or not grazed heavily to this point, or you have some regrowth from grazings early this spring, could potentially have some nitrate issues. Pastures that are already used up, probably less likely to be that concerned about.
Thank you, Eric. That is, well, we just got one more in, and then we're going to wrap it up. Any concerns with grazing CRP if it gets released in August?
I would say that fits into the scenario we were just discussing. Again, likely this is very species dependent, but we're not exactly sure which species are accumulating the nitrates right now. And so with a lack of more information, I would just say that that fits in the window of grass that I would definitely test before I turned anything out on.